Welcome to Tales of Britain and Ireland. This is a podcast telling the stories, legends and folktales of Britain and Ireland in no particular order. Presented by Graham and coming direct from South Yorkshire, each episode tells a story or selection of stories from all across these islands and throughout their history, followed by a short and decidedly inexpert discussion of the origin and themes of each tale. Welcome back all. Okay, I was going to do one episode on a tiny part of this story, but the more I read into it, the more I became caught up in it, and also thought, you know what, it's ages since I've done a long multi-part Tales of Britain and Ireland, and I'm sure people absolutely love them. So this is the first of what I expect to be 3 episodes, which I will try and release quite close together if I can, by my standards that is. I knew some of this story before I began. When I really got into the detail, I wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I did. In some ways, the story is a bit repetitive and the themes aren't quite the kind that I normally enjoy in a tale. However, the more I got into it, the more I found really interesting and amusing bits coming out of it, and that's why I've decided to give a go at sharing the whole thing and putting my own spin on it. So I don't really want to dilly-dally. I haven't got anything much more to say, except for my usual, this podcast will be continuing. I genuinely hope to take it places, oddly enough. If you like this podcast, then please do tell your friends about it. If you don't, then tell your enemies. Thank you so much for tuning in, which is definitely not the right term, but thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you really enjoy it. Quick content warning before we begin. This does include mention of, but no scenes of, sexual assault. And while I generally wouldn't recommend Tales of Britain and Ireland for children, I think this is one of my less child-friendly episodes. Definitely not the worst I've done, but just bear that in mind before you get stuck into it. There's a lot of early scenes of lust, shall we say. And let's kick off The Romance of Guy of Warwick, or to give it its pleasingly lengthy proper title, The Renowned History of the Life and Death of Guy, Earl of Warwick, containing his noble exploits and victories. And this time again I've got 2 prologues for you, which at least is justified by a 3-episode length story, unlike the last time I had 2 mysterious prologues. This first prologue must be set around about the time that the main story begins, but elsewhere. They did not know how the cow had come to be there at the foot of Corndon Hill. But that's normal, really. People don't know most things, and only fools and philosophers might consider lack of knowledge a good reason not to make use of what you find in the world. Some said she was a fairy cow, perhaps from the lakes of Wales, where many a legend spoke of herds living under the waters. Others said that she had belonged to a giant. This area in the borders was giant country, not 30 miles distant from the Wrekin, which locals knew well owed its origin to a giant, and non-locals knew well from listening to back episodes of Tales of Britain and Ireland. It was certainly possible, for even then she was a largish cow, though you'd think too small for a big giant. But whatever her origins, there could be no doubt that she was something very special indeed. For whenever milked, she would fill the pail presented to her completely, which wasn't a strange thing. What was that the next pail and the next and the next after that too, all would be filled. Pail after pail until every villager had the milk they needed. And when they returned, when that milk was all used up, then once again she would be as bountiful as ever. The only rule was simple. 1 vessel per person, and it would be filled. You could have as much as you needed. They say that it was a witch who did the deed. They would though, wouldn't they? Though I, for one, struggle with her motivations if she was a witch. I would like to say I generally find it hard to understand why any would hate to see everyone enriched. But alas, I know well that such feelings are common enough. Perhaps it would make more sense if the deed had been done by some local lord, angry that this cow existed that would give him no more than the lowliest of his indentured tenants, and thus decided if he couldn't have it all, no one could. Or maybe if it was Big Dairy that had done it, they certainly had a vested interest. But they say it was a witch, and still desperately searching for a reason for her to do it, I could assume that the people had already mistreated this poor woman, labelling her as a witch, and that she did the deed in response to their wickedness towards her. Or perhaps I'm just overthinking it, and she really did just do it because she was an evil witch. So what was the deed? Well, she took to the cow one day not a pail, but a riddle. By which I mean, of course, a large sieve, not a contrived question, the answer to which is something like fire or time or love. And the woman milked the cow into the riddle. The milk went through all the little holes and poured out onto the grass, and she milked and she milked and she milked, and on the flat field milk grew into a puddle which, after a while, was covering her feet. But she continued still. It got larger and larger until the cow's feet too were covered, and still the milk came, pouring impossibly out of this animal which could not have contained it, as though its udders were simply doorways to some endless milk dimension. The riddle itself had long sunk, and the witch began to despair. How much could this damn thing contain? She squeezed and she squeezed and she squeezed, and she was about to give up when one final drip, and the cow gave an awful pained moo of distress when she squeezed once more, finally abandoning passivity. And it ran, splashing through the milky lake, away, away at an incredible speed, all the while mooing quickly out of sight over the hill. Dripping, the witch stood up, smiling. She'd achieved exactly what she set out to do for whatever mysterious motivations. No more would they have a cow. Her arms were tired, her legs were sore from the squatting. She'd best get away from the scene of the crime. She took a step. She took a step, I said. She didn't take a step, she looked down. It was dark now, she'd been at it so long, so it was hard to make out what she was looking at exactly, as the last rays of sunlight reflected off the white pool, her feet in it. They looked wrong, though. She willed them to move again, and again they did not. She was rooted to the spot. She reached down with her arm to free her leg, except no, she did not. Spent limbs hung at her side, refusing to obey. Her clothes were taking on a greyish hue now. She let out a scream that was strangled as her windpipe petrified, and she had just about the time to consider that anyone with a cow magical enough to disobey the laws of physics might find it rather easy to protect with a curse, before her brain and body all was turned to black dolerite. And now we'll jump further ahead, a decade or so perhaps, after our story proper begins. The overwhelming majority of the time it was barely perceptible now. Not even an ache, just a feeling small and hard, so far down that she could go about her waking hours with it having no impact on her at all. But sometimes, especially in the ever-lonely nights, it emerged as a cloying sadness that weighed oh so heavily about her and cast the world in a drab grey, her thoughts and her limbs moving as though through tar. And just occasionally, so very infrequently that months might pass before the sense overcame her again, she found herself utterly consumed by an inescapable, unfulfilled longing, a desperation that sunk her to her knees, and she uttered uncontrollable mournful cries and shouts and screams for all that could have been, tearing at her hair, until there was a great eruption of white-hot fury which knew no bounds, an anger that seemed as deep as the ocean, as eternal of the heavens, utter, unrelenting hatred for him. Let's start proper. What does it mean to be a man? An old question indeed, one of the oldest, in fact. Now a simple answer presents itself. In fact, on a straightforward reading, the question seems to beg itself. To be a man is simply to be as a man. Nothing more, nothing less. Whatever a man is a man. surely. An attempt to give another answer is surely based on a category error. But this solution to this question has not proved a highly popular one, judging by how much seeking the correct answer has preoccupied the very earliest societies right up until the present, with no sign of it going away any time soon. It is possible that this story is meant, partially, to be one answer to that eternal question of masculinity. Though I'm unsure how practically useful it is to anyone actually seeking such an answer. But while it might not tell you ultimately what it means to be a man, it will at least answer the question of what it means to be a guy. One guy, very specifically. Very unusually for me, I am going to give you a backstory here far shorter than in the original. The version I'm taking most of my version from feels like it's a good idea to start the story by giving a reasonably lengthy summary of the entire history of England, including the Roman invasion and occupation, their subsequent withdrawal, the coming of the Anglo-Saxons, and all that goes with it, which is an approach to storytelling very much after my own heart. But in a radical move, I'm going to resist the temptation to do the same, and simply say that what we start in is now England. It was not always England, of course. And to set the stage, this is a time many centuries after the age of Arthur. After, in fact, Arthur's goal has failed. The land has fallen. The natives, the Britons, have been forced to its hinterlands or assimilated in, their culture erased, and the land instead named after its triumphant invaders. Though Arthur and his court were gone, this remained still very much an age of knights, an age of chivalry, and the knightly virtues of the Round Table were alive and well indeed. It was into this world that Guy was born. Some say it was a very lowly birth indeed. Others, which I minded more to trust, that it was a lowly birth only when compared to some of the really high-born types. You know, Kate Middleton is a commoner sort of way. And according to this version of the tale, which is the one we're going with, Guy's father had a long and storied ancestry in Northumbria, owner of some large estates there. But he was on the wrong side of a war and ended up far to the south in the city of Warwick. There he found himself steward of the castle. A castle we are given to understand is of some importance in the Anglo-Saxon world. Now, the steward isn't the person who owns the castle, it's the guy who's actually in charge of running it, sort of operations director type role. Far more hands-on than the earl who owns it. Not gentry himself, he has to work for his living, but pretty close. The title of steward comes with some considerable wealth and clout, but is still looked down upon by real nobles. Quick aside, I suggest you just sort of vibe with the history as presented in this story of definitely Anglo-Saxon England, and don't look too deeply into the history of chivalry or Google the founding date of Warwick Castle. Let such trifles concern you not, and just roll with it. It'll be better for you that way. Now Guy's mother, she was the equally lowly daughter of a very high-ranked knight, and from this pedigree came Guy. Indications that Guy was to be a rather more notable figure than either of his parents started before his birth. Guy's mother, who will remain unnamed, was dreaming. She stirred, eyes moving back and forth rapidly beneath closed eyelids. In her mind, a glorious technicolor dream in which the pagan god Mars, long since passed over for Christ of course, though he didn't seem to know it now, descended from an ember-orange sky in his great chariot pulled by 2 fiery dragons. What a look, yeah. Going all out, Mars. And Mars told Guy's mother that the babe she carried was to be a mighty warrior with no equal, the greatest hero of his nation, the very amazement of mankind, the terror of the pagan world. Unclear if Mars considered himself in that pagan world or not, but regardless. This was a very coherent dream, if you ask me. It didn't take place in your childhood home, except it wasn't really the home, because it was sort of like the office. But for some reason you were there. None of that. And this coherence made the dream's prophecy, I suppose, all the more convincing. And it wasn't long after Guy was born that there came signs that this pagan god-given prediction might have some truth to it. Now, if you are the sort who likes to believe that heroes are made rather than born, a nurture above nature sort, well, I'm sorry, but this story is probably not going to be much to your liking, for the message is clear. There was nothing particularly exceptional about Guy's upbringing. Preordination, biology, potentially some form of super biology, pagan god-given powers, these are the key attributes that make Guy special. Guy's abilities are, I think, more akin to a superhero than even to your average, unlikely but vaguely believable muscular 80s action hero. Guy Castiglianus, to give him his full name for the first and only time in this episode, because I'm not trying that again, was a boy born with extraordinary abilities. They manifested at a ludicrously early age. How early mostly depends on your threshold for incredulity. Let's say that by 8 years old he was wrestling and running and throwing stones, which is a thing, apparently, I assume big stones, and he was beating boys far larger than himself in wrestling matches and running races, and by the time we join him in the story, he is 16, and already no man can be found who is his equal. No montage needed here, he starts out hell of a strong. Though he had no particular exploits to his name, his fame has already spread a little, certainly in the local area. And at our story's start, he is a guest of the Earl of Warwick, the guy who actually owned the castle and indeed the town around it, and many lands aside. He treats his physically impressive steward's son as a bit of a figure of entertainment. His court sort of watches as Guy has competitions of strength and skill with all challengers, and all fall before Guy. The nobles watched and cheered and clapped, a great time was had by all, and the Earl is congratulated for the great entertainment he puts on, and as the story puts it, such fame Guy got due to his prevailing manhood. Ooh, matron, raised eyebrow. Now, some people will have you believe that this is a love story. But I'm going to be upfront with you. This is not a love story. The scene opens on 16-year-old Guy, and he is in love. He's never been in love before, too focused on wrestling and the like, and of course being a child. But recently he has laid eyes on the daughter of the Earl of Warwick, and she is the fairest maid he has ever seen, and that sight turned his thoughts from those of incessant victory to, let us say, ones more reflective of the breathtaking splendour of the female form. Her beauty was no doubt considerably elevated above many other women he had seen, not just by him coming of age, a late bloomer he seems to have been in that regard, but also because her great position enabled her to wear the very finest of clothes, the most rare of perfumes and ointments, the most spectacular makeup, all of course applied by her servants, all meaning that she stood out from common women, and all of this served to shake him from his hitherto single-minded focus. And thoughts of her soon filled his waking and sleeping hours alike. Oh, her eyes like shining stars, cheeks as smooth as alabaster, coral lips, teeth of white pearl, her golden tresses hanging around her as joyous wreaths. And the rest of her too, oh, that was too much to consider. And this great young warrior of superhuman strength would collapse backwards onto his bed, back of the hand to his forehead. I am lost, wrapped in clouds, trapped in a labyrinth. How dearly I wish that she could return the feelings that I have for her. But no, it cannot be, for she is of such high birth, and I so lowly. Such a match is simply impossible. She may not be destined to me, and so she must have been sent as a punishment, an angel from the Lord himself to ceaselessly torment my poor soul. But no, that cannot be right either. Such a creature could never hold cruelty or proud disdain within her heart. In risk of going full Gollum here a little. But what if she does hold such passions? How would you know? And then he'd sink back, overcome with it all. One moment in ecstasy, the next plunge deep into despair. We've all been there, right? Now, he had not actually talked to her, so we are looking at a pretty lust-based limerence here. But the distinction between this and other types of attraction was a line not so carefully demarcated in the young Guy's mind. There was no doubt for him that this was an experience of the purest, most intense love that had ever existed for anyone, ever. Very quickly it became apparent to those around him that Guy was acting strangely. He must be ill, they concluded, with that characteristic adult obliviousness to the hormonally charged emotional tempest of youth. And this conclusion was confirmed when one day Guy just didn't want to go hunting. Didn't want to go hunting? Unheard of. The Earl, who had by now sort of adopted Guy into his entourage, ordered him straight to bed, and even had his own personal physician check in on him. Didn't want to go hunting? Can't be long for this world. Now the doctor took one look at the pale, lovelorn teenager, and did what he did for any condition that was short of decapitation, sometimes even then. He recommended bed rest, regular bleeding, and good, healthy eating. Steak multiple times a day. In many ways, being a doctor was a little bit easier back in those days. "Thanks, Doc," said Guy, and waited till the man left. Now, Guy was genuinely ill, for at least in the terminology of the time, lovesickness was a well-recognised medical condition. And why not, I say? Its effects are certainly real, extreme, even debilitating. Honestly, I think in many ways they might have been onto something there. Though the large number of people who die of lovesickness in legends and myths is perhaps a little over-exaggerated. But illness or not, the symptoms weren't the type that would necessarily see Guy bedbound, particularly if he had a very good reason to be out of bed. So after a little bit of bloodletting and some steak, partially for keeping up appearances, but also because, gotta be good for you, Guy was up and out of bed, with a mind to effect his own cure. You see, now all the other men in the castle were out hunting. Usual Tales of Britain and Ireland disclaimer here. I obviously don't mean all the men. There were still lots of servants and other lowly born sorts around doing actual stuff. But all the men who were real men, by dint of being rich, that's one answer to that question of what makes a man, they were all gone, along with a fair number of other non-real men who would do most of the actual hunting work and take none of the glory. And with all other men gone, this created something of an opportunity for Guy. So off he went, just for a little explore of the castle, he said. That's all. Give it a proper look around. Admire the tapestries, the bosses, and the fine buttresses. And if he should happen to chance upon a particularly beautiful young woman while exploring, well, that could hardly be his fault, could it? Just a coincidence. He passed through room after room expediently on his personal hunting expedition. Having ascended the stairs to the lofty heights of some tower or other, no sight of her, he chanced to glance out of the turret window. It was a glorious day, blue sky with white clouds and the warm sun of late spring. And casting his eyes downwards to the gardens, his breath caught in his throat, there she was. The Earl's daughter, empress of his heart, sat alone in a shady bower. Before her the crystal water of a fountain played, and she was surrounded by a bloom of colour, surely the brightest, most fragrant flowers, which still paled in comparison to her. Guy's eyes widened. This was perfect. He ran down the spiral staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time with no concern for risk. I mean, he was Guy. He could probably just shake off a fall that would kill a regular man, but it wouldn't have been a good look. He was at the garden in, mere seconds. He could just see her through a window. She hadn't left, was still sitting there. He straightened his tunic, slicked back his hair, knocked on the wooden door that led to the garden. As he waited for it to be answered, all of a sudden he was suddenly awash with panic. Should he have brought flowers? No, you don't bring flowers to a garden. Chocolates, then. No, even with the messy chronology of the story, the Americas hadn't been discovered. Oh, then maybe he should have... But there was no time. The arched portal swung open. He smiled. He wasn't a man/boy used to smiling unthreateningly. Threateningly? Absolutely. Unthreatening, much less practice. So it was a bit off. But it was the best he had. Thankfully for his crooked smile, it was not Felice on the other side of the door, but one of her women. And yes, when I said she was alone in the garden, I meant that she had many waiting ladies with her, of course. Guy stammered, "Is the Lady Felice about?" Looking for all the world like a child asking an annoyed parent if a friend is coming out to play. Now, luckily for him, the maidservant assumed this man with his odd grimace, who she vaguely recognised as a brawler, had a message from Felice's father, had been sent from the hunt probably, so she waved him in with that expectation. Choirs of angels sang in Guy's mind. A shaft of sunlight seemed to illuminate her there, in that utterly idyllic setting, so close now. His heart pounded. Felice. Under the same misapprehension as her maid, she rose to receive the message. As she did so, she wafted exotic scents. Her bosom rose, her golden trestles fell gently, and caught the sun with a flash of gold. A perfect vision. Guy could contain himself no longer. He was on one knee, and it all burst out of him, and I quote, "Fairest of creatures, brightest of your sex, made of such kindred mould to heaven that you seem angelical, a goddess of all divine, I have here brought a heart by love's command to offer at your shrine. Oh, frown on me not with disdainful eyes, lest with such a look death enter, and destroy the man that ever shall admire, and with this awful a distance adore your matchless virtues." Pause for breath. Keep going. "Despise me not, thou only centre of my soul, who loves thee more than life. Oh, that I could express my boundless passion, or that thou couldst look into my breast, and there behold how the tormenting flames still roar about my heart, that with a continual fevers burn, in which the arrows of your pointed beauty stick. That lords and noblemen have courted you I am not ignorant, but none could love like me. Pardon my boldness, lady," ironic that to save my life I throw myself upon your mercy with the same fear a guilty prisoner beholds his angry judge, for your power's far greater when life or death depends upon your smiles or frown. Absolute silence. Now, before we get to Felice's reply, there is something that seems off to me here, gentle listener, and it may be my biases, but this language doesn't really sound like the type I'd expect to hear from Guy, given what we know of him already. His youth, his schooling being such as it was in feats of athleticism and martial prowess, most of what we see of him after this moment as well. Brave, strong, skilled, just, all these appellations can be applied to him, but purple prose, florid loquaciousness? Not so much. Now, of course, this was a unique situation. He may have risen to the demands of the moment, but it just seems out of character. And it seems much more in character with, say, a late Renaissance author who was trying to ape the wording of a medieval text. You know, like the author of the source I'm drawing this quote from. Coincidence? I'll let you be the judge of that. Now, I'm not suggesting Guy's actual words were at the level of, "I think you're well fit, love, fancy a shag," but there is some reason to doubt they were quite the delicately crafted and sort of beautiful word vomit that I've just put into Guy's mouth following on from the source. Bear that in mind. But whatever his actual words, the sentiment was the very same and came across loud and clear, an ardent expression of romantic love, under the surface of which swam a vast, all-consuming lust. There was a pause that went on slightly too long. It was finally broken by a laugh, a cruel laugh from Felice. "You what?" The attendant started giggling too. Guy, still kneeling, looked up. Confusion, panic. He felt himself turning red. A deeply uncomfortable feeling arose in his chest that he was not familiar with at all. Embarrassment, humiliation even. He wanted to punch something because that was how he dealt with his problems, but there was no one to punch. The laughter got louder and louder. Guy was trapped in a whirlpool of mortification. And Felice's mockery, oh, her laugh sweet and harmonious like the tinkling of tiny silver bells, a mellifluous mountain brook, cut deeper wounds than any sword. You are in love with me? What? In love with me? What do you think will happen? Marry me? There were tears in her eyes now. She gestured in a sort of amused what? Looked around at her attendees in bemusement. Some of them were almost doubled over with laughter now. Oh, that's brilliant, she wiped her eyes. What madness has possibly taken you so that you could believe that you, a steward's son, words she pronounced as though they were equivalent in meaning to the lowest of vermin, a steward's son would possibly be able to marry me, the Earl of Warwick's daughter. Oh, that's precious. Goodness. She took a few more moments wiping her eyes and giggling. I tell you what, young steward's son, because this has caused me such merriment, I will do you a very big favour and not let my father know about this whole thing. Oh, his wrath if he knew. Her expression turned serious and severe. But if you ever mention anything like this to me again, I will not be so kind. Now be gone from my presence at once. Guy, still kneeling, turned and pretty much crawled away out of the garden to the unsuppressed amusement of Felice and her waiting ladies. His face was burning bright. Stupid, what had he been thinking? He fled, not just the garden but the castle itself, retreating back to his childhood home. He felt truly sick now, nauseous, head swimming. Stupid. He pulled at his hair, wailed in despair. What had he done? Now he knew for certain how she felt, and the knowledge did not set him free but bound him in chains. He was a lowly nobody. She didn't even hate him, she just laughed. The scene played over and over in his mind. The whole world seemed to be crashing down around him. Conversation and laughter of those he passed in the streets cut him like a knife. No colour in the world any more. Everything cast in shades of black. Or, if you'll permit me to quote again from the source, my love, she is lost, forever gone. Sink earth's frame to thy first chaos, and with thy ruin crush mankind. Drop, ye stars and ever wakeful tapers of the skies, and let combustive flames purge this grosser world. Oh, she's gone, the beauty's gone, now night and darkness cease me, and eternal slumbers seal my eyes. And there we leave emo Guy suffering the awful pains of not just unrequited love, but now harshly rejected love. Despondency and hopelessness beckons for Guy as the scene fades out. Or does it? For when Felice went to bed that night, the most amusing events of the day were, of course, on her mind. Guy's confession of love, his ardent burning desire for her in her thoughts, along with memories of his face, his body, and when she went to sleep, those memories lodged there. And when she woke up the next day, she thought of him still. His passion. How he had looked. He was of a lower social class. It was ridiculous, she told herself. He was also an incredibly attractive man of roughly her own age, and she really wasn't permitted much contact with such people. No, he was beneath her. Beneath her in a social context, she meant. Definitely not beneath her in any other way. She desperately tried to put the thought out of her mind. Deep within her, strict social conditioning and biological urges wrestled with one another, just like Felice found herself thinking of wrestling with Guy. And that evening, ovulating perhaps, she could help herself no longer. In the privacy of her bed, under her sheets, her hands delved lower as she remembered Guy in the garden. And the day after that, it was even worse. She's not got out of bed yet, whispered her serving ladies between themselves. Must be very ill. but they were a lot more clued in than Guy's male companions about what might be the issue. After all, they had seen Guy, his love confession, his body, and they were much more aware of the ability of a low-born man to turn the head of a high-born woman who is supposed to have no such interests, as basically the entire world corpus of literature and folk songs attest to. Felice was soon consumed with a desire for Guy every bit as passionate as his for hers, potentially even less wholesome and more lust-based. This turnaround comes so swiftly in the narrative that I'm almost a bit confused about why we even have to find out that she first rejected him so cruelly. There's no will they won't they here, it's just they won't, and then they will. But that's how the story goes. So surely now you're thinking they're gonna get it on. And there was presumably an awkward bit where she had to discreetly seek him out, wallowing in his bath of despair, presumably on sight of her thinking she was about to unleash some fresh hell upon him, when to his astonishment and unimaginable delight, she apologises for her behaviour and confesses to him that she feels much the same, all the while gazing on him love-struck, full of desire. Desire, however, which still, after this confession, she could not actually act on, because while her passions may have sloughed the class-based mores from her own mind, it could not do the same for the rest of society. And so despite the abrupt turnaround in her affections, though the two gazed at each other figuratively if not literally drooling, cartoon hearts pounding out of their eyes, despite all of that tension, the electricity in the air between them, she could really only offer him a version of what she had told him originally, modified intensely in tone, of course, but not in actionable content, because the outcome was the same. Now she dearly wished to be with him, wished it more than anything else almost. But still she could not, because her father, the Earl of Warwick, would not have it. That whole thing about Guy being born upper middle class. So even though it was really difficult for her to not jump his bones right now, the fields of Venus must remain untilled. An upper class woman was not simply free to choose her lover. This was more than a tad frustrating for Guy, who was getting whiplash from the speed of the emotional turns, dashed on the jagged rocks of despair and then elevated up to the sweetest of the heavens and then thrown right back down again. What could possibly be done between the two of them now? Moving between classes was even harder then than it is now, given that class was based on inherited titles rather than on wealth. So if you weren't cunning enough to be born to the right person, not much chance of getting one. There were a very few means that such could be achieved. And one of those means actually seemed to fit really quite neatly with the path that Guy had been on before he had encountered Felice. In fact, in many ways, what comes next for Guy is simply keeping to that path. Felice some form of ornamental rockery along the way at which he stops and reflects, but now he has new reason to feel the gravel under his feet again, a whole new justification for what he was sort of doing already. Lady Felice, I will prove myself by my worth to your father, with spurs and laurels won from exceptional success in battle. Prove myself a warrior of such incomparable fame and renown that he could find only favour with me. And this sat well with Felice, and she promised with an excess of haste swept up in it all, and I will wait for you, remain chaste, unwed. I shall remain a virgin until you surely return a champion. Sure it will be, he said, getting into it now, for I will travel this world, carving your name in crimson characters upon the chest of the greatest warriors in it, wade through rivers of blood, climb to the top of the highest turret, so my eye may look down upon the world, its dread conqueror, all so I may return to you, my love. Or, words to that effect. None of that wording raised any red flags with Felice. So it was agreed, and then, in no time at all, this was it. Guy was setting off, leaving Warwick and the fateful Felice far behind, destined to return to them both. The hero's journey turns. The call to adventure has led to the crossing of the threshold. Now that adventure was calling was clear, but where it was calling to exactly, this was far more murky, though Guy considered that somewhat unimportant. If you're thinking he might go join the army or a crusade or find some local monster to kill, that would all make sense, but no, Guy just hops on the first boat out of England over to Normandy. No plan at all. He's off the boat and it's like he's fresh out of the training section of Medieval World RPG and straight into the open world, wandering around looking for random encounters. Just got an expectation that if he just goes into the world, there will be things for him to do that will somehow further the plot and allow him to level up. Which is, of course, not how the real world works. It went totally fine for Guy. The screen fades in and the player gains control of Guy on a dockside. The scene is gently backgrounded by a looping track called something like Sounds of a Busy Medieval Port 4, but with an accordion under it to give it a slightly French feel. It appears at first that there's all kinds of things to see and do and interact with, lots of conversations going on. But when Guy walks over to interact with them, the railroading begins. For there's a brief cutaway scene immediately that directs the attention to loud blasts of trumpets from somewhere far off in the city. And Guy is, without choosing to, immediately engaging a nearby NPC in conversation. There are two options on screen. 1. Leave conversation. 2. Ask about the trumpeteers. Guy tries clicking leave conversation to see what happens. Well, must be going. Au revoir, monsieur. He wanders around the dock, but there's no one else who brings up a talk-to interaction. And the snippet of conversation he overhears say something like, "Did you hear the trumpets? Ah, 'tis a terrible thing." So he's back to that first guy, and this time selects the Ask about the trumpeters option. Bonjour, monsieur. What business have you here in France? Hello, I've just arrived here from England. Do you know anything about those trumpets? Ah, sacre bleu, monsieur. C'est terrible. Okay, I'm not continuing the awfully offensive French accent, guys. This game, the narrative position of which is uncertain, can afford better voice actors than me. You're just going to have to imagine it from now on. It's terrible, the Norman NPC expositionizes. A young girl was most cruelly raped by the son of the Duke of Blois, you see. You get the chance to click a dialogue option for it to continue, but there's only one choice. How wretched! Yes, but that's just the beginning, monsieur. For the poor lady, Dorinda is her name, reported the crime. But then 4 ruffians hired by the Duke's son, the wicked Philibertus, swore an oath that they knew Dorinda had spoken falsely, that she made the accusation only because she was jealous of Philibertus and his upcoming marriage, because secretly she loved him. Nothing is further from the truth. Everyone knows it, but nothing can be done, for it is 4 of them against 1 of her. So now she is due to be burnt for her supposed crime. How awful, says Guy. The Duke has said that the only way she may be freed is if a man would fight all 4 of her accusers in turn, which is a perfectly normal way to assess guilt. Each accuser will, of course, be stronger than the one before him and employ a different style of fighting. But finding a champion willing to do so is surely impossible. And that seems to be the end of the dialogue. Thank you for the information, says Guy. Au revoir, monsieur. A pop-up box appears in the hood. Quest accepted. Fight the false accusers of Dorinda. A marker appears on the minimap along with a thick colourful line leading to it. And Guy dutifully follows the path. Though when he reaches the edge of the docks area to cross into the city proper, he does say out loud to himself, I should go no further without my horse. And then onlookers swear that he seems to still try to press on out of the docks, but says again to himself, I won't get far without a mount. And then again, I should go no further without my horse, before finally returning to the dockside, mounting the horse that no one had seen leave the ship, text appearing over Guy saying, Horse acquired. And then Guy and horse follow the illuminated path towards Dorinda at a gallop. he arrives to a vast throng of people surrounding a large cleared area of ground, in the middle of which is the poor Dorinda, fastened to a stake. 4 French ruffians enter the makeshift arena, conveniently at the moment that Guy arrives. I do think ruffian sounds, well, rough to me, like these might be lower class people with simple, rough-hewn weapons. But these were anything but. Finely bedecked warriors, the lot of them, polished armour, shining lances, great well-fed mounts of their own. "Does any fool dare to defend this lying strumpet?" asks the first. "If he does, then he shall know the wrath of my lance point." Guy nimbly avoids selecting the "actually, maybe this isn't for me" option, and instead replies in a booming voice which causes the crowd to turn as one in his direction. "I challenge you, sir." "Who are you?" The stylish ruffian sizes Guy up with a level of sneering disdain only possible by a Frenchman. Guy trotted his horse into the makeshift tawny ground, turned to face his opponent. "Guy of Warwick, I left my native soil of England to win renown, to help the helpless, defend the friendless, side with the downtrodden against the mighty and the wicked, my quest to relieve those that oppressing tyrants crush, and so gain fame, so that I may be worthy of my beloved." Which isn't quite how I remember it going down, but, it turns out the guy is pretty good at this whole PR thing. So, like another guy bearing a flamed shirt, let's just let him cook, shall we? And then, because he was absolutely full of himself, if this is a computer game, this is not his first time through. This is time number 5, and he is going to get every achievement this time. He adds, "And I'm not interested in this one-at-a-time business. I'll take you all at once." The other 3 men looked up. Okay then. But the one who'd spoken first silenced them with a raise of his gauntlet. "No, I shall enjoy slaughtering this arrogant English pig all by myself." He signalled the trumpeters. The trumpets parped, and then he lowered his spear and his visor both, and charged full at Guy, hooves a-thundering. Guy did much the same, and the two met in the middle, and everything happened in the blur of a moment. Guy's spear punched straight through his opponent's armour, impaling him and knocking him from his horse all at once. He groaned feebly for just an instant, and then died. "How about the rest of you then?" said Guy cockily. The other 3 drew their weapons, rushed at Guy on their own mounts. Lance still protruding from the first man, Guy drew a sword from his side, and with swift, brutal combos hacked through his opponent's armour so that limbs rained down upon the tawny ground, and within moments 2 more were dead. Multi-kill! The last man was severely wounded, blood pouring from him, and he was on his knees now, begging for his life. "Tell everyone what really happened," said Guy. And the desperate man blabbed the whole scheme, how Philibertus was guilty, how he'd raped poor Dorinda, how they'd been bribed by him to lie. All the while he was begging for mercy. Guy turned to the crowd. "You heard all that!" The crowd booed and hissed the ruffian. Guy pushed the wretched man down with his foot, but did not execute him, left him to the mob. He cut Dorinda's bonds, then took her to her waiting friends. They were reunited with a great outpouring of emotion, tears of joy. They offered Guy gold and jewels, but he spurned them. All he cared about was that she was taken where she could be safe outside of the Duke's domain. And he turned to the crowd again. "Remember my name, Guy of Warwick." And they went wild. As he rode away, he had one more thought, turned back and said, "And believe women." A rapturous applause and a whooping and a hollering broke out. What a guy! Quest complete. Guy arrived back at his ship, the adrenaline rush very slowly wearing off. How incredible had that been! His first ever quest. Amazing! Though he'd hunted and fought before, this was also his first ever killing, and it had excited him on a level that nothing else had touched. The wicked falling at his hand, sword slashing down, him victorious and good, the wild approbation. It was like nothing else, and already he was consumed by the desire to recapture that ecstasy. Guy tried to tell the ship's captain what had happened, but found himself tripping over his words in his heightened excitement. Adventure, good deed, woman saved, men dead, limbs everywhere. I'm fucking great at fighting. So much blood and not a bit of it mine. Bad men dead. And that Philibertus, what a dick. But it's okay, I sorted it. The people, they love me. They love me. Whoa, slow down. And when eventually the captain got the sense of it out of Guy, then he turned his eyes to the dockside. Noticed a few guards arriving, whispering surreptitiously to other guards, fingers being pointed in the direction of their ship. And the captain wasted no time. Okay, we are out of here. Come on, horse, back on the ship. Leaving already? Said Guy. Oh yeah, it's like one of those cruises. You never get quite the time you expect on shore. Quickly, right, lads, chop. And the ship set sail just as the heightened military activity on the dockside reached the level of commotion. The sky and the sea alike were perfect blue. A few hours had passed, and Guy had told everyone on the ship about his exploits at least twice. Many who hadn't managed to avoid it had heard it a third or a fourth time. But while I might be sniffy about it, the audience did appreciate it. For he had done an incredibly good and incredibly impressive thing. People really like tales of violence and justice. He was just about settled, enjoying a moment of rare quiet, admiring the ocean, when the captain shouted, "Ship ahoy!" Now this was before the invention of the telescope, so the captain put one fist on top of the other, opened his hands up until there was kind of a circle through the two hands, and then raised them to his eye. There was no doubt. They were being pursued, a French ship heading for them. "How did they find us?" asked Guy, standing beneath the sail. He'd insisted to be painted with a huge cross of St. George, so everyone knew where they'd come from. "Not a clue," said the captain, "but they are definitely heading our way. One ship only, but they've men on board. Armed men." He squinted harder, brought the circle of his hands in tighter. "They must have 3 or 4 times our number." "Okay, we've got to get away." "Full sail," he cried. "Full sail," came the reply. Crew members sprang into action. And just below the surface, Guy felt it. That feeling of adventure. The feeling that there was a fight to be had. He quivered slightly, but not from nerves. With anticipation and excitement. He'd rested, and now he was ready, and oh so eager. "Just 3 times the number, you say?" "Didn't actually say just." Well, will not let it be said that the famous Guy of Warwick ran away from one tiny little ship. No. Turn us about. The captain looked at Guy, now stood up, sword suddenly in his hand, the man practically vibrating. And in that moment, despite himself, he believed it. "Belay that order. Bring her around." An hour passed before the French ship drew level with the English one. The sun was low in the sky now. In command of the vessel was none other than Philibertus himself, the no-good rapist son of the Duke of Blois. He had heard what had happened. He also assumed that the Englishman had had more help than in the account that had been passed to him, and he thought that Guy had stolen away the woman Dorinda for his own nefarious purposes. He couldn't imagine any other explanation for why he might have stood up for her. So he was here for revenge, to get the girl back and to dump her and Guy into the sea. As they approached, the English ship was oddly silent, the crew seemingly unarmed. This was going to be easier than he thought. They'd clearly realised the helplessness of their situation. "Grappling hooks," ordered Philibertus. A whistle as the hooks sailed through the air and caught on the side of Guy's ship. The crew didn't even try to remove them. Clearly they'd given in already. There was a heaving and the 2 wooden vessels were pulled together. "Planks down, board her," Philibertus ordered. but in French. A dozen men walked across, and still the English crew barely reacted at all, hanging back just as Guy had ordered. "Right, we're taking this ship. We're here for the knight and the harlot. Don't you try to stop us." And all eyes turned, as with a clanking of armour, Guy stood up, raised his visor. "You have awakened me," he said, which I'm pretty sure was just for dramatic effect, for he hadn't really been sleeping, he'd planned all of this. But the theatre of it all, the theatre was almost as important to him as the actual violence. "And for such rudeness, well, you may have caused me to wake, but I shall in return gift you a very long sleep, a sleep that lasts till Judgment Day." "Quoi?" asked the confused leader of the boarding party. "OK, it wasn't the strongest quip. I'll make it simpler for you. I'm going to kill every single one of you." Smiles formed and quickly turned into mocking laughter, and for an instant Guy was back in that garden. But this time, he was absolutely allowed to use violence to resolve the problem. "You're going to kill all of..." Despite his formidable size and suit of armour, Guy moved so fast the man didn't see him coming. The sword sliced his head from his body, his mouth still forming a word. His companions started to shout and lunge at Guy now. Their blows glanced off his armour or sliced into air where he had been a moment before, but now he was chopping the limbs off one of their companions. Their own armour seemed completely useless. Guy's blows shattered or punctured it, a whirlwind of havoc and destruction. "Get him!" shouted Philibertus, urging more of his men over the planks and into the fray. It was Guy now who laughed as blood spurted, guts spilled. A panic was beginning to take over. Many of the men didn't really even understand what was happening. It was as though they were fighting some kind of demon assailing them from all sides. Philibertus looked on in absolute shock as his own men started to leap into the water to escape. But then reality cut through. "Ungrapple! Ungrapple!" And in desperation the men started to cut the rope of the grappling hooks from their side. But it was too late. The last of the boarding party fell with a horrifying crunch. Guy turned his attention to the enemy vessel, took a run on the blood-washed deck, nimbly avoiding fresh corpses and hewn appendages, and took a great leap, landing on the deck of the French ship with a thud that positively dipped the vessel into the water. "Get him!" shouted Philibertus, retreating behind his men. Men who Guy cut down left and right. One huge blow from an enemy drew sparks from his helmet that should have caused instant death in a regular person, but Guy was anything but a regular Guy. He didn't even register it, just returned a blow that sliced the unfortunate man clean into two pieces. The upper half hit the deck with a crash, while his legs, they stood upright for 2 long seconds before collapsing. Anyone else, said Guy. The soldiers began to back away now in all directions, and with a great clatter they threw down their weaponry, begging for mercy. Philibertus joined them, pathetically begging for his life despite all the awful things he'd done. And to this, Guy, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, said, "OK, I will always grant clemency, but you are all my prisoners." Turns out Guy was a big fan of the Geneva Convention and/or not tying up loose ends. He did, however, tie up Philibertus and his few remaining soldiers, and march them back over the plank to his own ship, to the rapturous amazement and thunderous applause of the crew, who couldn't quite believe what they'd seen. Glad he's on our side. And Guy soaked it all up again. The fighting, the quick victory, the murder, the adrenaline, the incredible reception, the do-gooding. Once again, it was intoxicating. And oh, it was so easy. He was so much more powerful than any other opponent. Really was like a child of the god Mars himself, imbued with all the power of a medieval superhero. Before they set off, for one last thrill, he dumped the multitude of corpses in the sea and decoupled Philibertus's ship, setting it alight, so that they could look back upon it as they sailed away to their next destination. Guy watched it as they left, growing ever smaller. A candle on the twilight horizon. they arrived further along the coast of Normandy, and there to do bureaucratic medieval stuff, get the prisoners' ransoms paid. Philibertus is amongst them. No jail for him for all his misdeed, just ransom paid off, and then he's out on the mean streets again. GTA-style rules for the nobility, apparently. So what next exactly? For about 2 minutes, Guy had no obvious quest to follow. Maybe he should have planned something? But no, none of that, because it won't last long. The ship is moored, more ambient dock sounds are at play, and Guy is ashore. And well, doesn't he just overhear a conversation between dockhands that goes something like this. Have you heard about the tournament that the German emperor is throwing? You mean the one to win his daughter's hand in marriage? That's the one, and other riches I understand. Jewels, a pack of hounds, a milk-white steed, a fearsome falcon. Any man who wins that will be set up for life. Yes, not for the likes of us dock workers. No, certainly not. The finest warriors in Europe will be competing. It will require a man of masterful skill at arms to win such a tournament, and the wonderful prizes, not to mention the valour that would go with it. Indeed. Oh well, best keep loading these barrels. Now, Guy could choose to ignore that conversation. You might be thinking, a tournament? But I thought he was all do-goody now. That doesn't sound very do-goody. And if you're thinking that, do remember that that was more the gloss that Guy put on it. This is all, ostensibly at least, all about Felice. What he is after is enough notoriety and fame that her dad will accept him, and everything else is just a nice to have. And a tournament, that suggested potential adulation. Also, there doesn't seem to be much else to do in the docks anyway. Some fish to buy, a crate unaccountably containing jewels that Guy can bash open and somehow attract no attention for doing so, but not much else. So instead, he approaches the dockhands, who are starting the same conversation again. Have you heard about the tournament that the German emperor is throwing? You mean the one to win his daughter's hand in marriage? Guy presses talk. Hello, gentlemen. Bonjour. And after a rapid-fire dialogue click-through, a new region, Germany, is now available to travel to. And Germany is marked with a quest. Does he want to leave now? Wait, I've a few things to do here still, he says to no one in particular. Guy gives his thanks to the captain and passes off the duty of ransom collection to him and his crew. You'll be wanting some yourself, though, says the captain. I suppose so, says Guy. Just send a courier to me or something when it's sorted. Honestly, it was really worth it for the experience. The experience? Oh, yes. And Guy's eyes shine. The experience of slaughtering all those wicked men, seeing the fear in their eyes of witnessing their complete submission to me, who's so superior to all of them, of burning that ship, the experience of seeing good triumph over wickedness, the experience of being loved, admired and feared all at once, that's enough for me. But yeah, if you want to send me some ransom money, that's fine. The captain smiles nervously. And then Guy selects Travel to Region, Germany, and begins the quest, Emperor's Tournament. If you are particularly paying attention, you might at this stage be thinking, hang on, this is a tournament to win a woman's hand in marriage. But Guy has pledged his devotion to Felice. And if you are, I just want to announce preemptively, so that you're not worried about it, this is not some huge plot hole. Though it is quite strange. Just be patient. Guy arrives at the very formal and huge tourney field to find it the most spectacular he has ever seen. No surprise there, really. This is the Holy Roman Empire at its absolute height. Remember, put down history books, don't you dare try to get into the chronology of this story. This is, somehow, the Holy Roman Empire at its height. And a pre-marriage party thrown by its emperor has one of the biggest budgets of any event in all the world. Why is he choosing this method to give his daughter away? It doesn't feel like a particularly savvy use of a daughter, which were always good for cross-dynasty alliance making. Given to the winner of a tournament only meant that she would be married to a man distinguished only by his ability to inflict violence. And maybe by quite a lot of luck as well, which seems like a terrible way to pick a husband both from her perspective and from the Emperor's. It's not explained why he was doing this. I sort of assume that maybe he just didn't like her very much, and that this was all part of a bread and circuses deal. An excuse for a great big party, so everyone will be talking about how stellar a dude the Emperor was for years afterwards, because of the bitch-ass tournament he held that time, which I understand is a pretty historically accurate reason such events were thrown. In attendance were a positive who's who of European nobility, each trying to outdo the other in the grandiosity of their retinues. Again, to ensure that they were the most remembered, most talked about by all the lesser nobility and even the odd members of the middle classes who were in attendance. All around the tournament ground were arrayed the hopeful warriors, accompanied by bannermen and musicians, the air filled with the sound of trumpets. Sunlight reflected off polished armour, banners streamed, giving the effect of the whole field being bathed in holy flame. Watching over it was the Emperor, and beside him was his trophy daughter Blanche. So, distastefully enough, any prospective tournamentees could peruse the goods before deciding whether to compete or not. No word on how she feels about this, but I can't imagine it was the best. And of course, it goes without saying that she was the most beautiful of all women, the usual overwrought, hyperbolized epithets of poets. But Guy, of course, had seen Felice and already decided that she was the most beautiful in all the world. He told her so. Surely he couldn't think that Princess Blanche was just as beautiful. Surely not. But some people clearly took her to be the most beautiful, and there was therefore a large amount of fighting to take place. They had a match-up system where winners of jousts and foot combat would go on to fight other winners until there would be a last man standing. There might even be a melee thrown in there because everyone loves a melee and it takes out a few people at once. All of this meant there was a great deal of entertainment for those watching, a few hours, possibly even a day or more. And at Guy's arrival, Prince Philianus, some German with an un-German name, was facing off against Earl Spartianus, another German with an un-German name. Lances down, steeds charging at each other full power. The horses met, the lances exploded, as lances tend to do, splinters flying around them, and then the men drew their swords and fought from horseback for a good long while to the cheers of the crowd, until finally a true strike from Philianus knocked the Earl from his horse, and the prince was declared the victor. His defeated opponent carried off, still groaning, just to show that he was alive. A-team villain-like. This one fight had taken far too long for Guy's liking. Ridiculous it was. All these people had to fight one another, one after the other, so inefficient. They'd be here for ages, and he had stuff to do. No idea what stuff, but apparently he did. Fuck this, he thought. And so, with no herald to announce him, he rode onto the tournament field just as the prince was doing his victory lap. The un-Germanly named German prince turned at Guy's entrance. I imagine sort of side-eyed him. He just had a whole fight here, and this random guy, literally, rides on fresh as a daisy. Hardly fair. But this wasn't the sort of tournament that was too strict on enforcing the rules. And, well, the prince didn't recognise this guy, so how much of a threat could he really be? A few seconds later, he found out. Having actually managed to parry a blow or two, impressively enough, Guy presumably had done enough to power up his special attack, brought his sword down with incredible force upon the prince's helmet, smashing it and the head under it in. Philianus fell from his horse, looking dead to all the world, though if you hovered over him with the cursor it would just say, knocked out, even if it really didn't look like that was possibly the case. Now the crowd's reaction to this swift-fire victory was rather mixed. A bit unsporting, but they had got a very impressive display of violence, and they liked that. So there were some cheers for Guy's victory, but less than had accompanied the fight beforehand. One man watching had a very strong reaction indeed, though. Otton, Duke of Tuscany. Prince Philianus was a good friend of his, and he'd just seen him possibly killed by this nobody who entered very ungraciously. Duke Otton didn't even want to marry the princess. He wasn't even part of the combat, but he did want to avenge his friend. In he rode, swearing that this interloper's head would be his. Surely the man will be tired now. Let's see how he likes an unfair fight. Guy parried the Duke's first and only blow with a yawn, and then in return dealt him one that cut through both his armour and mail shirt deep into his flesh, causing a torrent of blood to burst forth. The Duke soon lost consciousness, toppled from his horse, and would have died if some doctors hadn't rushed on and stayed his blood. Conveniently for Guy. Or at least for his reputation of not being outrightly evil, though I have to admit I'm a bit confused as to the rules here. You would expect tournaments to expect some deaths. However, all we had now was two definitely not murders, just two men mauled with life-destroying injuries. So that's all right. Ignoring the fallen opponents, Guy turned to the other hopefuls. Anyone else? Anyone else? There were. Next was Duke Rainier, who actually knew Blanche and she him. He was sure he would triumph because, quote, "Your armour can be no match for my love." A misunderstanding of both armour and love there. And you know how this goes. A flash of swords, a clash of steel, the inevitable felling of Duke Rainier at one of Guy's trademark superhuman armour-cleaving blows. The crowd was sort of reduced to an impressed, uncertain silence now. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. It wasn't normal. Some began to whisper that this was no man at all, but a spirit, given human form, some eidolon of battle. More combatants came, and I won't bore you with repetition, for each fell before Guy's blows, conveniently suffering injuries that were just a speck below mortal. Until finally, though some hopefuls still hadn't stepped up, the cream of the crop had all been thoroughly bested by this monster of a man who had barely broken a sweat. And no one remained who would dare to take up the challenge. The Emperor was just as taken aback as the rest of the crowd. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. But he clearly won the tournament, and an Emperor's word has to be trusted, at least when very publicly announced, so he summoned him. "You have fought very well, unknown champion. What should I call you?" "Oh, I am Guy of Warwick. England," he said after the Emperor looked blank. "Well, England must be fortunate to have you as its champion." "They really are," said Guy, "though I have been away from there too long, detained by war, you understand." A line that's either a lie, or there's a lot of bits of this story missing, and I have to tend towards the latter. I sort of think there's a lot that happens off-screen that we don't see. I mean, possibly Guy had fought in a war at some point, though when? No idea. Anyway, doesn't really matter. If he has fought in a war, we can assume he beat everyone involved pretty much single-handedly. "Well," said the Emperor, still a tad reluctantly, "you've won your prize fair and square, no doubt about that, so here's my daughter." He indicated Blanche. "We'll sort out all the rest of the prize stuff later, but, take her as a down payment. And if you want, you can take her into this tent and get yourself acquainted." Which, yeah, yikes. "I'll leave. Would be awkward otherwise," said the Emperor, and left this blood-spattered, stone-cold killer alone with his daughter. I've spoken on the subject of bad fairy tale dads before. The Emperor is somewhere up there. Once again, I find myself left uncertain as to Guy's actual words to the presumably very nervous, possibly outright terrified princess. Still covered in the gore of his enemies, he addressed her, either as the writers of the story have it, "Fair angel, in whom nature's chief perfections shine," or something more akin to, "Look, you are really, really pretty. But, you see, I've already got a woman in England, who I pledge to remain constant to. And she is so beautiful. Honestly, I thought she was the most beautiful woman of all the world, but I can see beholding you, actually, I was wrong. The two of you are pretty much tied for most beautiful woman in all the world. Which, wow, Guy, shaking my head here, way to offend everybody. If I thought for a moment he was just saying it in some misguided attempt to avoid hurting Blanche's feelings, I might have some more respect, but oh no. He clearly believes this. He's now encountered a second most beautiful woman. He hasn't put two and two together that maybe his judgment on Felice was a little premature. Never mind. So both of you are equally pretty, but I've sworn an oath to her, and I'm going to have to keep it. So yes, you're absolutely lovely, very lovely. Oh, so pretty you are, absolutely gorgeous, wonderful, but no can do. Sorry about that. I can only imagine Blanche standing there, utterly stunned. What? I'll fetch your dad, shall I? I'll let him know as well. And Guy went to find the Emperor, explain the situation. You see, I'm pledged to another woman, so she's lovely and all, but I can't take her. Don't worry, she's still a virgin, I'm an honourable man. For the second time in about half an hour, the Emperor was shocked, almost speechless. He searched for the words. Sorry, you what? I appreciate the offer and all. I'll just take the cash equivalent, and all those other things, the greyhounds, the horse, falcon, they sound wonderful as well. The Emperor flaps his mouth, considers how cut short the day's entertainment was, compared to the grand tournament he'd imagined. Sorry, I think I misheard you. I'll keep it simple, says Guy. I've already got one. You've already got one, repeats the Emperor. The Emperor looks at the tournament field, surrounded as it is by the shattered, doctor-tended bodies of the richest, bravest, most eligible suitors for his daughter's hand, and in some cases their friends as well, and then considers the small clutch of men who remain unharmed, not a decent bloke amongst them. Somehow, he composes himself not to say, "Then why the bloody fucking hell did you take part in a tournament explicitly to win a wife? The prize was a woman, but you've already got one." No, outwardly he remains calm. And you know what, adds Guy to no one in particular, I think it's time for me to go back to England for a bit. Been on 2 or 3 quests now, that's enough for me. You're right, Emperor, you look a bit peaky. Flabbergasted Emperor noises. I can only presume the things holding the Emperor back from having Guy executed on the spot are a general sense of fair play in keeping his word, and maybe a little fear of the seemingly superpowered Englishman. I am actually quite impressed he manages to keep his cool. But he does. He does insist that Guy is immediately given a ship back to England, and accompanied to that ship by all the nobles and soldiers of the court, who all watch him get on it, give a little wave, and wait for him to leave. Why did he compete? So many injured. What about the marriage? And when Guy's ship finally disappears over the horizon, I imagine they all sort of turn to each other, and there is an unspoken agreement that they would never speak of this ever again. As for Guy, well, he is on another ship with those greyhounds and horses and falcons and whatever else it was the Emperor promised, all given to him free, so he's feeling pretty good about himself. So much so that he is already heading back to England. Apparently, these 3 brief adventures are enough, in his view, and, to be fair, fighting in one of the most notable tournaments in Europe only to spurn the prize is the kind of thing that gets people talking. So off he goes, back to Blighty with his goals fulfilled. He's wealthier, much praised, well known, and he now has a decided taste for violence. And we will leave him as the white cliffs of Albion appear on the horizon, and surely he is thinking of his darling Felice, how he cannot wait to get back to her and give her the good news. Surely that's what he's thinking about. And after a quick to be continued, the credits roll. But after only a couple of names, the primary cast members, they fade out. A post-credits sequence. We fade in on a peaceful medieval village, a rural idyll. All timber-framed thatched housing, people working, children playing, chickens on the muddy straw streets. Someone runs into the centre of the village, panting. Stop! It's coming! It's coming! Run! The ground shakes. There are screams of panic. Something is approaching, and the supposedly non-diegetic camera seems knocked to the floor, lens to the mud before going completely black as you hear a sound starting, before being cut off as the rest of the credits roll. So, discussion section then, and just to reassure you, because I'm sure you're so worried, because this is one of 3, I'm going to keep this discussion section spoiler free for what I've not covered yet and talk about that in more detail in future episodes. So this discussion section is really a high level overview of the history of the story of Guy of Warwick, without going too much into the details. And if there was one thing I want you to take away from it, you can turn off after I've said this and you'll get the main thrust of this, it's that the story of Guy of Warwick has been phenomenally popular in England and indeed elsewhere, basically since it burst onto the scene at the start of the 13th century, remaining very popular with all swathes of people right up until really the 19th and 20th centuries, when it first waned and then precipitously collapsed in popularity, especially compared to, say, King Arthur. So this tale is no longer a particularly well-known one, but for most of its history, that is not the case. Of all the stories I've covered on the podcast, I'm pretty sure this is the most popular, widely known, and circulated throughout the centuries. The only one that might possibly give it a run for its money is the stories of the Fenian cycle, and there are lots of those, and then you're sort of comparing a mostly oral tradition against a much better represented literary one, and that's a bit of an uneven matchup. Even then, I think for sheer numbers and how well known it was, Guy is going to come out ahead. And this leads to 2 major problems with doing a discussion section on this story versus other stories I often do. And they're sort of opposite problems in many ways. On one case, there is just too much material to summarise at all comprehensively, or for me to really get my head properly around in any good time. And believe me, I have spent far too much time researching this topic for the summary I'm going to give you now. There are literally thousands upon thousands of pages of versions of this tale, and then academic works talking about the tale, which are themselves thousands more pages. And those academic works can get incredibly detailed and specific. You know, spending pages and pages looking at particular spellings or orthography to work out which area of the country a certain version of a manuscript was produced. Which is fascinating, very far out of my comfort zone, and also not that useful for you if I want to convey overview information succinctly. And the second problem, ironically sort of, is that because there is so much work by scholars on this, and quite a few relatively modern academic texts, which contain key findings and theories, and there are academic arguments that go on about Guy of Warwick to this very day, these texts are considerably outside my budget, let us say, because however academic publishing prices work is, in my view, completely insane. Though I have to admit that despite this, I really want to get 1 or 2 of them, but... And what this means is that I've not really been able to read as widely as I'd like to around this. And so especially when it comes to such things as the provenance of the story, then I don't have the most up-to-date theories detailed out for me. I've sort of had to impute them from various other sources. And so I say all that to say that I'm going to do my very best here, but bear in mind those key caveats before I jump into this. I am especially reliant on 2 texts for everything I'm going to say here. One is written in 1915 by Ronald S. Crane, The Vogue for Guy of Warwick, from the close of the Middle Ages to the Romantic Revival. And the other is a PhD dissertation, Guy of Warwick, Study and Transcription, by Alison Wiggins from the year 2000, which I think later formed the basis for a book. Though I have taken account of what's said in other later sources when I can get them. So disclaimers out the way, Guy of Warwick then. So Guy of Warwick first appears as an Anglo-Norman romance written in about the 1200s or so. When I say Anglo-Norman here, that is the language. It is a variety of French that's used by the English ruling classes following the Norman invasion. Those ruling classes are a mixture of Norman and English, and in a few generations they become somewhat difficult to disentangle for each other. And they, and the language of Anglo-Norman, is notable both by being not continental French and not generally spoken or understood by the people of England, just restricted to the English noble class, and that's where this work comes from, or at least was written for. So the term romance is one that's much argued over and fraught, but I'm using it here in a generally agreed way just to refer to medieval literature that is secular. And whatever the outliers in that category, everyone pretty much agrees that Guy of Warwick is definitely a romance. I should say at this point that in its original composition it rhymes, as was the style at the time. And it was very long. I've seen 13,000 lines referenced, which is proper novel size, all rhyming, and bigger than most comparable Anglo-Norman romances. So as I said, it's first composed around about 1200 or so. There's no consensus on exactly when or why it was composed. It's been theorised that it might have been composed for an actual Earl of Warwick to celebrate some event or other, but I'm not going to list those there because there's no scholarly consensus on it, and most of the claims I've seen along that line are rapidly debunked. However, there does seem to be some agreement that it was probably, possibly caveated out, composed by or for someone connected with Warwickshire or that general area. Though, spoiler here, Warwick doesn't actually feature in that much of the action. It is sometimes considered together with other similar medieval Anglo-Norman and Middle English romances that are sometimes grouped together to form a so-called Matter of England. The exact characteristics of these manuscripts are somewhat poorly defined, but they are typically stories written about and set in England, often, like Guy, set in the Anglo-Saxon period. Others include Bevis of Hampton and Athelstan, but Guy also shares similarities with other medieval romances set slightly after that period. Havelock the Dane and Fulk Fitzwarren are others of these, and I covered a tiny bit of Fitzwarren in the Giant episode. From the earliest version of it, the story of Guy of Warwick is the story of his life. This is not a King Arthur or a Fionn McCool with lots of connected characters and offshoot tales. It's a much more basic, complete narrative. In broad form, it is fairly similar to the version I'm telling you on the podcast, but as I'll come on to later, I'm pulling that from a later version. It seems to have been pretty popular from its creation. We have copies made of the manuscripts. This is well before printing, of course, and in the early days there are two primary versions that seem to have been copied multiple times that have differences between them that go on to reflect in the differences in retellings throughout the ages. Well known in England from an early period, it was particularly favoured in, no surprise, Warwick itself, and quite quickly the Anglo-Norman Beauchamp family, that is Beauchamp spelt B-E-A-U-C-H-A-M-P, by the way, proper bucket situation there. The Beauchamp family tied the legend quite closely to themselves, and they were the actual real-life Earls of Warwick. And when I say closely tied themselves to it, in 1271 or 1272, an actual Guy was born, literally named after Guy of Warwick, who then went on to become the Earl of Warwick in 1298, which seems pretty wild. But they didn't stop there. I'll go into some more detail on a later episode, but suffice to say, this close association with the Beauchamp family, with Warwick Castle, founded 1068 if you're wondering, and indeed Warwick City, continued long after, and indeed, in the case of the latter two, continues right up to this very day. Around 1300, around the time that Guy was actually becoming Earl of Warwick, the story is translated from Anglo-Norman into Middle English. Still rhyming, of course, and at that point the versions of it multiply. And it continues to be copied. There are various versions of it in manuscripts in the next couple of centuries, and at that point it reaches some international fame as well. There are French, Catalan, Italian, Irish versions and more. There's something about this story that very clearly appeals. Even at this relatively early period, trying to make sense of these versions and the differences and similarities between them is very difficult. I have not done it. Some scholars have. Their works go into a great load of detail. All I think we really need to understand is there are a lot of different versions, though I would say that unlike some other stories, there's no radical changes in the plot. The base plot remains the same. The story as told in these later versions is almost always substantially shorter than in the original, which was a very long romance, as I said before. Now, while there isn't ever a Guy of Warwick extended universe, as we get into the 15th century, individual episodes of the story, episodes which I'm not going to mention, also get cut off into their own little mini-stories that circulate in songs and poems and prose verses independently. Some of these are stories that aren't in the original manuscripts, and how they arose is a bit uncertain. And many of these themselves become popular, though always, I think, within the context of the existence of the main story, which none of them directly contradict. There is even a text of religious instruction that's written as though given to Guy of Warwick, as a bit of a hook to get people interested, I assume, which is just wonderful. And it's called Speculum Guy de Warwick, which made me giggle because apparently I've still got the sense of humour of a particularly immature teenager. You find references to Guy cropping up in other works at this point, most famously in the Canterbury Tales, where it's a sort of archetypal example of romances, though that quote is also somewhat poking fun at it, which suggests not everyone thought that Guy of Warwick and chivalric romances in general were very good. In fact, a lot of the references we find to Guy of Warwick in other works are less than complimentary about it, in that way that people are often snooty about things that are widely popular. This did not stop Guy of Warwick remaining very popular. During all this time I've talked about manuscript production, it is also clearly surviving in oral storytelling, which was of course the primary way that stories were told, and indeed the manuscripts themselves often refer to an audience as if they were meant for recitation. And when printing comes along at the end of the 15th century, it jumps swiftly into that medium. In about 1497, a version of Guy of Warwick is one of the earlier works to be published by none other than Wynkyn de Worde. Wynkyn de Worde. Wynkyn de Worde, Wynkyn de Worde. Unsure, but however you say it, it's very satisfying to do so. In the 16th century, that's the 1500s, it was published many, many times more, a testament to its continued popularity, which was not the case for many medieval romances. The reasons for this romance's particular popularity are varied and argued over, and I don't want to give too much away with spoilers, so I might go into another episode, but there's certainly something to do with Guy being seen as an English hero, and also probably connected to the fact that there was a specific real-life place connected with him, which, to some extent, set itself up as a bit of a tourist trap when it came to Guy of Warwick. But for whatever the reason, the popularity of Guy continued. By the end of the 16th century, the long rhyming romances had stopped being printed. The story of Guy was moving now into other forms, into considerably shorter ballads, printings of which exist from the end of the 16th century, though the ballads themselves certainly date earlier than that, and those would go on to be widely popular in their own right. These not only provided very quick summaries of the story, but also changed and added new bits that might have come from a separate and parallel oral tradition of Guy of Warwick tales. Probably goes without saying that not long after this there are play versions of the life of Guy of Warwick, because this is peak English Renaissance theatre time. Even though Shakespeare didn't have a go at one himself, lots of other people did. And towards the end of the 17th century, we have many chapbook versions of the tale printed and widely circulated. Some long, some short. By this time, there were fully prose versions of the story, incorporating various different ideas that have attached themselves to the medieval romance through the ballads and other influences. And amongst these chapbook versions, in 1861, there is one called The Renowned History or the Life and Death of Guy, Earl of Warwick, containing his noble exploits and victories, by one John Shirley. And it is this 1681 version that I am using as my template for this tale, with so far at least relatively little deviation as to the events, though I've definitely interpreted it differently, and Shirley has somewhat fewer computer game references peppered throughout his text. Shirley's version lengthwise, I think, is a nice balance. Nowhere near the older medieval versions, but also substantially meatier than the ballads. It's about 30,000 words long, which is probably the same as what my telling over 3 episodes will come to. What my telling won't have is spoilerific chapter summaries, which books published at this time really seem to like. But they seem a bit odd today. Why do you want to know what happens before it happens? But I suppose if you scroll on TikTok or Instagram nowadays, people will often describe a video's content before going into further detail to get you engaged. And I think these chapter headings might serve as similar hooks. To give you an example of what I mean, this is the chapter heading of the middle episode of this tale taken from Shirley. Quote, "How Guy put to sea, landed in Normandy, where he fought with 3 champions, killing 2 of them and wounding the 3rd, taking from them a lady who had been wrongfully condemned to die by the young Duke of Blois, who had ravished her." I mean, yep, that is what happens. Hardly seems worth reading now. Anyway, I chose that version of the tale to tell you because it's a pretty good balance in length, because it's in pretty comprehensible modernish prose. My Middle English is not very good, and I have tried, but also because I like that it's brought in elements that weren't in the original medieval romances. It's a bit more varied in many ways, and while I could have told the earlier medieval version, it sort of lacks, well, at least one very important, iconic factor in the story, which you can see making its way into mine. But despite the differences, the Shirley version also does maintain the general form of the medieval story, and even in some cases, Middle English medieval rhymes are sort of worked into the prose here and there. You may have spotted a couple from me when I quoted directly. Later versions tend to drop those entirely, so I sort of thought it was nice to take from one that was somewhere in the middle. Overall, it seemed a decent balance. Any academics who know this topic, please refrain from commenting on how ridiculous that statement sounds. I would be lying if I said I'd spent ages picking the perfect Guy of Warwick to adapt. I should be very clear to you by now, there are tons and tons of versions of this story knocking around, and I just happened to pick one I fancied. Other variants of this tale are available, and none can be really seen as the definitive tale. There ain't one. There's been many different guys throughout the centuries, and none of them are more or less legit than the others. All good guys. And I'm going to leave that here for now, to be picked up next episode. And well, guys, collectively, gender-neutrally, unlike Guy of Warwick, who is a paragon of manliness, obviously, it only remains for me to say I hope you can bear with me through a multi-episode story. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening. It means so much to me that you are enjoying this podcast. I mean, I assume you're enjoying it if you've made it this far. If not, switch off, go outside, life's too short. And a massive thanks to all the people who stuck with me on Patreon. You can sign up there and get 14 members episodes now, and you only ever pay when I release a new episode. And I will be doing that soon, all about a spooky woman from Devon. Thanks to Freddie Harper, Deborah Love and Maz for signing up since the last episode. You will get your first Patreon episode very soon. That's it. I'll be back next time with more Guy of Warwick adventures, where I'm certain, having got his notoriety, he'll just get married to Felice and settle down to live the quiet life. You can follow Tales of Britain and Ireland podcast on Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads and Facebook. There's also a website, talesofbritainandireland.com, where there's a page for each episode which contains more information, including illustrations, asides and recaps, along with other additional bits and pieces to explore. The intro music was written and performed by Alice Nichols, and the outro music by Mitch Keeley and Josh Newman. And you can find all the other musical credits on the episode page on the website. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please do share it with others or give it a review, as those really are the best ways to help us out. You can also join Tales of Britain and Ireland on Patreon to get extra members episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again soon.